It is an absolute privilege to be here. I am Marissa Hall, co-head of the Thinking Ahead Institute at Willis Towers Watson. I'm here with Darren Johnson, Chief Operating Officer, Listed Equities at Impax Asset Management. We absolutely live in uncertain and difficult times. The killing of George Floyd and the resultant protest around social and racial injustice have awakened our society to the fact that for many Black people and for many minorities, our world does not yet feel equal. While we may all be entitled to inalienable human rights, such as fairness, equality, and respect, it was President Barack Obama who noted in his farewell address, it is the insistence that these rights, while self-evident, have never been self-executing. It is tempting and easy to believe that some of the injustices that minorities face are only noteworthy for the history books. But for many in this country, the challenge remains real, and the statistics are sobering. We are reminded that, for example, Black people in our society are less likely to be employed, are paid less even with similar qualifications, are less likely to be in leadership positions, and in our industry, in this investment industry, we know that less than 1% of fund managers are Black. Today, we want to go as deep as 20 minutes will allow us to really talk about race and racism in the industry. We will have time for some questions, and so obviously, please feel free to submit these. There is so much to say. Darren, this year, we all experienced this confluence of tragedies highlighting aspects of racial inequality. You know, examples such as George Floyd mentioned earlier, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, locally, Belly Mujinga. You know, where these tragedies have proven to be examples of, is our society actually and really equal? And we've also had a lot of companies, you know, issuing statements and putting out narratives saying that, you know, they stand against racism, they fight for racial injustice. And for some of them, the rhetoric is meeting the reality and they are starting to take action. Yet, despite some of the obvious actions that we've put out there, and we've talked about it as part of Talk About Black, you know, something is still stopping real change from happening. Something is still stopping, you know, a reduction in ethnicity pay gaps, equal rights for employees, you know, the microaggressions in the workplace. And so there remains that gap between what companies say they're going to do and what they actually do. It feels as if we're always in the stage of convincing others that we need racial justice. So this is where I want to start, Darren. What do you believe is stopping our industry from moving beyond the narrative and driving real change?
Thanks, Marissa. Just quickly, you know, I'm delighted to be speaking to you about this. And I just want to thank the whole of the Diversity Project and team for having me on this talk. So I think it's a really interesting question you ask and quite complex, I guess. But if I was to pull out maybe three things, three general things, I think one of the issues is how it's positioned and the understanding of how it benefits everyone, this topic of diversity in regards to race and Black specifically. Also this misstepping point as well about, you know, how to talk about this without causing offense. And lastly, language, maybe related to misstepping, but the language that's used that sometimes is unhelpful.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's talk about the misstepping. You know, what do you mean? Is it people inadvertently making mistakes? What do you mean by misstepping?
Yeah, so you know, I've spoken to a lot of my white friends, white colleagues about the subject of diversity and inclusion, and what they seem to always say to me is, look, you know, whenever there's a discussion about this, we don't feel particularly wanted in the room. We kind of feel that, you know, we're not part of the conversation. And then when we do try and engage in that conversation, what happens is that, you know, they're just worried about saying something wrong. I think, you know, and then sometimes it comes off as they're not engaging. It comes off as that they're not interested, or they're intolerant, or in the extreme, they're racist because they're staying silent. And there's this phenomenon of a council culture where, you know, if someone says something that's deemed as wrong, that, you know, they get vilified. And I always use the example of Wells Fargo and the CEO and what he said. You know, he's trying to recruit more Black talent, and you know, he wrote a memo, I think back in June, and he basically said that he couldn't find any, and I'm paraphrasing. And of course, he got vilified for that, and where he basically, I was thinking that's an opportunity for someone to educate him. That's an opportunity for a recruitment firm specializing in diversity to contact him, and really, if you can't make a clumsy mistake, I'll use that word, in discussing these issues, if you're always going to be potentially jumped on or vilified for it, it's very hard to, you know, move beyond the conversation.
So, okay, so therefore what you're calling out is for a genuine collaboration between, well, let's all take care of each other. You know, let's be authentic and genuine in our questions, in our search for understanding more about, you know, race and racism in our industry and in others, but also calling out for, you know, people going out and educating themselves and learning. And, you know, I remember it was someone who said, well, I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you. And really it's about, you know, doing a journey where you actually go out and you learn. So no, completely understand that. I mean, let's talk a bit about language you mentioned. And, you know, there are lots of terms bandied around there. Often you hear this term about privilege, and privilege being invisible to those who have it. What are your thoughts about privilege in our industry? What do you mean?
Yeah, so with language, so I use BAME as an example. So when we use language like BAME, you kind of combine everybody's underrepresentation in the same ball, and you assume it's the same, they have the same weighting, which they don't in BAME. And then, so when you're a Black person and you hear that term, particularly in our industry, you feel like maybe it's a whataboutism, right? So it's about, you know, what about this, what about that? But you know, when you're Black and you look in the industry, you feel that, well, you can see that you are underrepresented, and you are underrepresented in certain roles. So sometimes that language, as soon as that's kind of used and you're trying to have a conversation, it may mean that, you know, people are a bit defensive about it. And then also with this privilege word, so typically when I hear privilege, I hear white privilege. And I know that is an unhelpful term when trying to discuss these issues. So already, again, you hear that, and some people get defensive, and you do struggle to move beyond the conversation. But just to unpack white privilege, I sort of understand that, you know, the context it's being used in, and sometimes it's just not helpful the way it's kind of said. But to give it context, it's basically saying that, you know, being privileged doesn't necessarily mean having it easy. It's not saying that, you know, if you're white, you didn't have a tough upbringing, for example. Instead, it's simply an expression of the fact that regardless of your circumstances, if you're white, you kind of enjoy certain advantages because of your whiteness that people of color don't enjoy. So to give an example, one example is, you know, the sense of belonging, right? So everywhere, you know, a white person looks, you know, you see representation. So you see white people in government, as leaders of industry. They write, typically they're writing textbooks or books. At school, they're the teachers, actors, movie stars, TV anchors, directors, you know, the list goes on. And of course, not all of these people are white, they are predominantly white. So, you know, you can understand that, or hopefully you can understand that if you're Black, you know, sometimes you may feel that you don't belong.
So how do you bring about inclusion? How do you bridge that divide between, well, this is a policy for, you know, today's special interest group. How do you bring everybody into the conversation? People who are white, people who are Black, you know, people, you know, this crosses all diversity lines, you know, men, women. How do you make everybody feel included? Is that not a tough challenge?
It is tough, but I guess it's how you approach it and how you position it. So to go back to my earlier comment about my white colleagues and friends and discussing this topic, you know, as I said, they feel that sometimes they're not wanted in the room. They're, you know, seen as part of the problem and not seen as part of the solution. And it feels like, you know, quite frankly, they say everyone's out to get white men, right? That's how they sometimes feel. Now, being on the other side of that, I can completely understand that that's not how we want anyone to feel at times. So, sorry, being on the other side of that. So, you know, how you try and get this dealt with is that, of course, you include everyone, and how you position this to me is that, you know, this diversity topic does not have to be a zero-sum game, i.e., where one faction wins and another faction loses. Although, you know, that can be true, but that's not always so, and it shouldn't be in our industry. The emphasis really should be on change, which is hard, but, you know, it's palatable, right? And the conversation needs to be kind of positioned not as a zero sum, but as enlarging the pie, right? I guess we need to re-envision diversity and inclusion as a coming together, not just a letting in.
Well, let's try and pick up some questions from the audience, Darren. I know you probably have access to these too. Please do obviously keep your questions coming in. There's one here around why do you think the focus on gender has not benefited Black women? And what can we do to ensure that this intersectionality is taken into account when we set gender targets? I might pick that one up, Darren. I think, you know, one of the things I was reminded of, you know, recently is that when we talk about, you know, well, in the US anyway, when women, you know, were getting the right to vote, actually what it was in the first instance was that it was very much focused on not all women, but actually it was focused on white women. And I think what's happened is that we have had such a box ticking approach to dealing with diversity, where we say, well, actually, let's deal with women, let's deal with ethnicity, let's deal with something else, that actually we haven't taken into consideration the fact that there is that intersectionality. So for me, yes, I'm a woman, but yes, I'm also Black. Yes, I'm also a mother, and I'm also, you know, a British citizen. And I think that, you know, you need to recognize that these different aspects of your identity come out in different contexts. And so for me, I think there was an element of what people were comfortable with. So if you know, to your point about, you know, missteps before, Darren, if what you are comfortable with is, well, actually, I've got a mom, I've got a sister, I've got a brother, but they all pretty much look like me. That historically was the thing where people thought, well, actually, we're comfortable with that. Let's let that group in. And actually, we need to take the emphasis from let's let that group in now. Let's let women who are, you know, privileged or educated, that group in now. Or even as we go along, let's let Black men in now. And actually, we need to have a more holistic conversation where we are human. And actually, what are the skills that we are looking for in our organizations? What are the qualities that we value in people? So caring and kindness and servant leadership. And only when we can actually say, well, we respect you for your full identity, whether you're Black, whether you're white, whether you're, you know, you're old or whether you're young, that's the only time that we can actually have a fully inclusive conversation. So yes, I view this as a warning sign to some extent, this question, where we need to make sure that we don't just think, well, what's the group that we talk about now? Actually, let's think about the humanness of all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to just, I completely agree. And I don't know if it's appropriate to use the analogy of houses being on fire, or a house being on fire and all these other houses are not, and how you focus on putting out the fire here, because it's like this all lives matter, Black Lives Matter, and we always say, look, you've got a house on fire, there's all these houses, but also there are little fires in all these other houses, and if you put out this fire, you kind of may stop the contagion across all of it. So what I'm trying to say is that there's intersectionality in everything that we're trying to do around diversity and inclusion, and particularly on the topic of Black. If you look at some of the things that we want to happen, it's going to help Black people, women, Black women, people with disabilities, LGBTQ, all of these communities. And I think that's something that really needs to be thought about, because, I think just going back to one of your earlier questions about how we can move beyond the conversation, we sometimes make perfect the enemy of the good. So we're trying to find perfection. We're trying to deal with this, deal with that. So when we talk about intersectionality, it's like another another issue. How do we deal with that? And really, as I said, you need to start somewhere, and you need to make it a strategy, right? Don't think about it tactically, think about it strategically. And if you do that, then hopefully you pick up these issues and you make sure that Black women, white men, LGBTQ, everyone has an equal playing field.
I might ask you just a couple of quick fire questions. I know we're conscious of time. And as we said, in this topic, there's so much we can do. What do you think about ethnicity targets? Popular question. What do you think?
I think if you don't have targets or aspirational targets, it's hard to measure how you're doing against them. And what I like about targets is that you can then tie it to people's performance and people's pay, and add inclusion in there. Because also the danger of targets is, okay, let's go out and hire all these diverse people, but if you don't have the inclusion, what's the point? You're not going to keep hold of them, and you're still going to have these disparities within your organization. So targets are good, but I should actually say we should link that definitely with inclusion. We need to have the right environments, the right culture for people to be able to thrive and progress and bring themselves to work before we push on with targets, for sure.
Absolutely. There's another one that's probably quick. Do we need to have more white allies openly speaking about privilege? I think so. I think that conversation, communication, it helps. And this is what bridges the gap. Just like how we need more Black people to talk about their personal experiences. And I know one of our colleagues on Talk About Black, Justin, he sent out a LinkedIn post earlier today talking about his experience growing up as Black. So I think we need more of that narrative so that we can make that connection. I think I'll take one more. Do you think socioeconomic background also have an impact on opportunity for people who are not white? So let's talk about that. Just that link between socioeconomic disadvantage and people who are not white.
Yeah, I think it's hard to disentangle ethnicity from that, actually, in the main. I do think it does have an impact because your frames of reference, so if you come from a lower socioeconomic background, it's likely that your frames of reference to people around you also do. So in terms of your aspirations, you may not have huge aspirations. For me, I came from a lower socioeconomic background, and the only reason why I'm here is because I watched a program that I aspired to be the character on that program who happened to be in this industry. And if I didn't see that, if I didn't have that, even though that role model to me was not relatable as an actor, Michael J. Fox, I wouldn't be where I am today. So I think it is really, that is important, and what we need to do is actually have more representation, actually, so that people can see how society and how themselves in society, in the high echelons of society.
Any final words first, Darren? Any actions? What do you think we should do?
Yeah, so I think the call to action for us would be, obviously Talk About Black has been talking about these issues for a long time. There's details on the website, but apart from that, I would say, look, be courageous. A misstep in the right direction is better than being sure-footed in silence. So be courageous, have conversations, have conversations like this. If you want your firm to stand up for inclusion, you also need to stand up. That's so important. Don't let the fear of a misstep hold you back from full engagement on the topic of race in the workplace. Also, educate yourself. And when I say educate yourself, I mean everyone. Educate yourself. You know, this is Black people, minorities, white people. Everyone should educate themselves about the issues around minorities, women, LGBTQ, and what other marginalized groups face, including the compounding effects of intersectional identities, just to your point as well, Marissa, earlier. And to me, inclusion means inclusion. So everyone needs to be involved in solving the problem and do have accountability for change. Just on that topic about targets, you know, I guess diversity is simply the difference, but the opportunity continues to be inclusion. And what firms should do is create conditions for everyone in your firm to contribute to finding solutions around race and inequality. And, you know, I guess lastly, I'd say, look, you know, people that have heard me speak before have heard me talk about COVID. And what I'm really proud of is how our industry has managed and coped with COVID, not only operationally, making sure we can still service our clients, but also our outreach and charitable work, helping people less fortunate than ourselves. Now, we have the ability to mobilize like we've done there, and we have been mobilizing, we have been moving forward in D&I, but we still haven't cracked it. And what I would want is for us to try and move beyond the conversation and actually start taking action and moving this topic forward so that we can talk about other things.
No, absolutely. No, and thank you for that. I mean, it reminds me of a quote. It was, you know, I say this often, Nobel Peace Prize winner Archbishop Desmond Tutu, where he reminded us that, you know, my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. And I find a lot of hope in these words, this concept of our shared humanity and progress on racial justice. It benefits us all. So thank you very much for your thoughts, Darren. I'll pass back over to you, Upi.